This is completely independent MuleSoft meetup group. We don't receive any kind of sponsorship or monetary contributions or anything like that from MuleSoft. The reason it is to be kept independent is that the MuleSoft meetups are absolutely fantastic. I attend them as well. I join in the Connects and all the other events that they do, but there seems to be a bit of a demand for a slightly independent view where people are able to voice their views, etc., and operate slightly independently and therefore kind of discuss wider API integration and microservices challenges, etc. That's why the group is designed to be for the community, by the community, and again, kind of various vendors, not just vendors, partners, etc., get involved in it. Over to John, who's just going to give a quick share on who Third Republic are.
Third Republic, in essence, we are a recruitment business first and foremost. I now specialise within placing people into the MuleSoft ecosystem across the UK and Europe, primarily sort of the Benelux and DAC regions, into partners, into customers. And I think, as Chris said, as to why the group started, the amount of people we speak to and engage with that want that community to be there, to speak to other developers, architects, consultants. We want to bring those people together and hopefully, off the back of that, we can build better relationships with you guys, with some of the partners, some of the customers to do our jobs as well. But, whilst we're doing that, bring everyone together in this space whilst we do it.
This is now the 10th meetup. It's been going for 3 years now. We have 699 members currently. So if you've got any friends, family, maybe register your dog, cat, that's fine as well. We'll take them all. But yeah, nearly 700 members, which is a huge achievement. And thank you for everybody for sharing it and being involved in the events and making them such a success. It really means a lot, and hopefully everybody's benefiting from it. From what I know, it is the largest MuleSoft meetup group in Europe. We're going to try and gauge a little bit tonight if there is a bit more of an appetite for wider integration topics. And I suppose this is probably a suitable juncture for me to hand over to Jay, who I think is going to pick that up.
Effective API integration, this is part 2. There was a part 1. We sort of ended with the cliffhanger, so we'll kind of pick up from where we left off. What I'll do is do a quick kind of recap so everyone's kind of back into the context and kind of go from there. Before that, what I do want to do is acknowledge just the panel. We've got Gil from Codcoats. We've got Harry from CAP, Lakshmi from MX, Thejas from TUI, Vaughan from Codcore as well. Just a quick recap on some of the posts that we did last time, in terms of, what's the biggest influence on kind of ineffectiveness of APIs. I think the clear winner there was insufficient governance. I would probably say the second was insufficient experience and knowledge. So that was an interesting poll from last time. How difficult is it to name resources for APIs? There's a lot of people sort of thought it was okay. There's quite a few people that thought it's actually quite hard. Gil shared some insights into how that could be made easier, and hopefully a few more people did a few more Googling on reification and found that useful. And what we stopped on was what makes PMA go faster. A lot of people thought it was experience. A lot of people thought it was use of patterns, something that we're going to be covering later in this slide deck. So that's interesting. A few people thought it was voodoo. A few people thought it was automation. So I'm interested to hear what Lakshmi thinks, because that was her kind of use case on that. So just quickly on the recap, we talked about reification. It's about making abstract things a little bit more concrete. So, consumers can kind of predict what the verbs will do to that abstract thing. We had an example of, using verb noun on the left in terms of cancel timer, trigger timer, into, time triggers where you could say there's a trigger that's timed, and you can update it to say it started, change the status, etc. This is something that Gail introduced for us in the last session. And then this is sort of where we stopped. We said, imagine there are two teams. You ask the two teams to make similar changes to the APIs or products. Team A comes back with half a day estimate. Team B comes back with forward estimate Y. And we did do a poll last time, and that was the result. And that's how you make teams go faster. You've replaced all the automation with humans beings on the inside, and everything will go fast. So the key thing here I want to highlight is, Team A, shorter estimates, they're more responsive to the market and demands of the user. Team B, because there are long lead times, they can be seen as kind of slow and inefficient development programs. And I'm sure, we've been there many times in terms of programs like that, where we felt this is not moving fast enough. So Lakshmi, do you want to share a little bit about your experience and why, because you've had this in real life where you literally had two teams who were asked to do the same thing, and you've got two very different responses back. So do you want to share a little bit there?
Yeah. So I think I have a little story to share then, right? So I was in one of these engagements where, the team's response or the team's, agility in terms of, building an API or coming up with solutions to the capabilities was quite quick, right? And I think it was a scenario where I said, okay, this must be just one-off, and let's see what happens as a pattern, right? But as a pattern, it continued to be, a very quick response and a very high quality deliverable, right? And I started wondering at that stage to say, how is this happening consistently within the team, right? It was not, and when I looked at the profiles of the team members who were part of that team, they all didn't look like they're all senior engineers or they had a huge experience with MuleSoft or any integration technologies as well. So that was very, keen point for me to say, how is this working then? So when I got a little deeper and looked at what they do day in, day out, so the key for their success was automation, complete automation, right? So it was more of even a simple click of deploying onto cloud, or even everything Jenkins, integration with Jira to see the status. So there was no dependency on anyone just coming into the meeting and telling you about the status or showing where they are, or even after finishing their work when the PR request is approved. So that's it. That's the end of the life cycle for that requirement or capability for an engineer, right? So then he moves on and picks up another one. So that's why they were really agile, and every time they came up with a very good quality deliverable as well, right? So that since then, I've been a big fan of automation. So I think even if it's just a simple click for deployment, what we need to do is, if we had that manual process there, then we need another person overlooking him. And then there is a process, there is a downtime and all that, right? So if you automate it, it's more repeatable, right? So yeah, that was my experience with this team. And since then, I've been a big fan of automation. And then I've always asked my team, or in my projects, I've always ensured that most of the work that we do, wherever possible, as quickly as possible, we get onto automation, right? Because that eliminates the need for the manual work and errors.
One key takeaway that I take away from your story is, the junior developers, who are just starting out in this field, actually they can perform, or they can outperform some of the more experienced engineers just by making sure what they're working on is kind of fully automated. There is a good kind of saying that a good engineer never does things twice, because he automates it the first time round, or she automates it the first time round. So it's an interesting dilemma. Have you got any examples of what are some of the things they automated? You obviously talked about deployment as one, but is there any other use cases or anything else that they've done that you could share with us?
Yeah, I think they did. In this specific program, they went really extreme steps, right? So their integration test suite, their mocking, like if they had a dependency on, they obviously are working with a multi-vendor kind of a program, right? So when they had the dependency with another vendor, so they never really waited for the other vendors' test URLs or test system URLs to be up and running for them to be testing their own code, right? They would easily mock it, and that they would stub it at that point, and most of their approach was test-driven development as well. So I think they kind of use that to challenge, to say, write a code to pass it or fail it, right? So these test cases were written. So I think a combination of that TDD approach with complete automation, right? And removing that dependency from the external vendors or your external systems or anything like that was a key for their success. Yeah.
I've got one more question before I open it to the floor for any sort of questions they might have. I know a little bit about the setup that you have, in that sense that you know your team or your organization is heavily pursuing domain-driven design, and you've talked about a multi-vendor type of setup. Obviously, in that case, you have multiple teams who might be dependent on each other for services, etc. And how has mocking or kind of contract first design and automating that worked? You know, can you give us a sense of number of dependencies and how complex that environment is?
Yeah, okay. So as you rightly mentioned there, Jay, so it's domain-driven design, and we're working in an enterprise ecosystem, right? So where we always have that dependency on some of the other systems in the enterprise to say, is that going to be my priority to be in line with what you need, kind of, right? So that priorities always clashes. So with that context, I think a couple of things as a strategy works. One is obviously do a priority planning. That's all on the planning side. But in terms of coming on to the automation and mocking and stubbing, so one thing that happens with this kind of a framework, the automation framework that we built was, once you set up this mindset of everything being automated within the team, the engineers no longer are complaining about, okay, I don't have the system to say my code is ready, right? So they know that there is a mock that we have built. There's a mocking system. There's an emulation that is happening. So as long as the code is working, the code that they have built is working for that mocking system, so they move on to the next piece of the code. So which means the deliverables are quite quicker, right? So then the engineers are not getting bored as well to say, oh, I'm doing the same thing, I'm just stuck. It's a repeated fashion of just wait and wait until you get the other team or the vendor APIs, right? So there's that constant stream of work that is getting done, and they move on to something else, and then when the actual integration happens, so there's no longer even a dependency on a specific engineer, right? To say they need to do that end to end because they have built that code for the mock and things like that, right? So that way, I have seen one thing is your team spirit is high, up and doing, and then you're covering more, you have more deliverables that's coming out of that part of their execution.
Jay Dixit asks, is any better approach in case my API spec being updated after API implementation is ready? So I guess the question is around moving specifications. So if you agreed a specification and you built something and now the specifications changed, any sort of guidance on that?
Yeah, that's a classic that happens in most of our projects, isn't it, when we have this integration kind of effort. So I think in my experience, automation can help you to an extent in that case, right? But most of it is I know we all struggle with the resources, right? When you have versioning implemented with your APIs, and then when you have that clear visibility to say, okay, I'm at least doing this for now. If there is a change, then I know it's another version that I need to bring it up and support it or implement, right? So I think that's one thing as a strategy that we use to say, if an API spec is changing, then is there any way that we can control it with versioning, right? Or in cases where it's really not possible, then yeah, you put your hands down and say, yeah, I need to get this working.
I also think there's a Mule specific question in there, which is, do you need to regenerate the flows with the new API spec? Typically, you don't have to. If you added new resources, etc., you might have to go in and add new routes in the API router config. But typically, what you're changing are the fields. You're not typically changing resources around too much. But having said that, that does happen. But I don't know if anybody else wants to pitch in with an answer there. Maybe
just to add on the previous question, Amit here. When we are saying the API spec is getting changed, obviously everyone talks about the design first point. It never happens in the practical way, but yes, there are alternate options. First, we need to identify if it is a breakable change or non-breakable change. If it is non-breakable change, definitely you can go ahead and you can continue your implementation. If it is a breakable change, go ahead for the API versioning instead of redoing all the things. That should be the approach you should take it, I would say.
Yeah,
semantic versioning is a good point.
Maybe I have one question here. How did you, what are the challenges you face when you kind of persuade somebody from replacing a point-to-point based integration solutions into a domain-driven API catalog-based API-led approach? So what are the challenges generally you face from the business community or from the architectural community? Because domain-driven, I don't think in any organization you are allowed to start things from scratch, right? Either you will be put into a position to replace some legacy or revamp the whole point-to-point integration. So is there some insights and challenges and some experience how you handled the challenges to share here?
I think one thing that I can say from my experience, Jay, is a domain-driven design, as Bala was rightly saying, right? It's a paradigm shift across the organization, right? To say this is how our architecture is going to be based on, and these are my clear separations, right? So now I'm bringing the whole team. I think one of the things that has worked really well in the program that I'm on with domain-driven design is also aligning your team with your domain, right? So then there is that specific domain team as well. Then there is that focus that they're doing, and there is that paradigm across the program to say, okay, so if there is any capability or requirement that's impacting a specific domain, then we know who is our point of contact, who is our specialist, who is the architect, who is the team working on that, right? So I think when setting it up, it's obviously a paradigm change. So there is going to be a lot of queries on this needs to be, we're just creating silos. That's one feedback that commonly comes in the domain-driven design and the teams, right? When we set up our teams to say, eventually you're going to have silo teams. There's not going to be cross knowledge sharing across the teams and all that. So I think it's a paradigm shift, but I have seen working best with domain-driven design and the mindset and the team aligned with that paradigm is there is accountability, right? And there is that quick learning curve that happens within a specific domain, right? So because you're no longer looking at the whole program on its own and rather focusing on a specific domain. So then you have that flexibility to be able to just understand the boundaries and the constraints of that specific domain, and then it helps anybody to be able to quickly get onto the subject matter expert, right? So for me, I think that has worked in some of the projects that I've been. But I think, as rightly said, domain-driven design is usually a paradigm shift, and then there's lots of convincing that needs to happen from the leadership and the organization, right?
Yeah, so that's the major challenge we are facing,
Correct.
Lakshmi, as you rightly said. We have almost 120 departments, or you can call it as major domains, and you have a lot of subdomains under that, and reaching out and handling the segment architects or the so-called functional architects and persuading them towards and domain-driven design thinking is like a humongous task. So maybe any materials or any tricks and tips how you handle in your organization.
So I'm working I'm working for a big bank at this moment, and they are moving on to the domain driven. All this time they were all point to point, and now with this latest era of microservices, but they still want to talk about various areas, and the functional architect actually is helping us a lot at this moment. So I can say he or she, whoever is the functional architect, will be stretched out, because now they have to bring everyone onto the same platform and allow them to speak the same language, which is obviously going to be a challenge. But yeah, I can share some of the learnings that I had in last 7 to 8 months working with the functional architects. I'm from the technical community, and now I need to collaborate with the business. But yeah, he's helping me a lot.
That would be a great help, Charan. And
sure,
another additional sub point or challenge what we are facing is when you wanted to sell the use case or the benefit of domain-driven design, it's always difficult for us to kind of quantify the reusability and highlight to them why we need to do this, what would be the advantage of the end outcome of the domain-driven design, how it's supporting. There is no like basically when you go and talk to a business, an IMIT manager, the number one question he would ask, what is the dollar value I'm going to get out of this overall conversion of point to point into a domain-driven and API-led architecture, right? So that is also another challenge, because I can keep on talking to them and showcase and reusable benefits of the reusability, but till you do the actual design, you will not be able to demonstrate it, right?
All right, if I just give you one hint on the typical problem that you are facing, but that one hint is we have a group of people who are sitting on the fence, which we call like an onboarding team. So they understand and they put in a lot of efforts, and we have people from all the different areas, like the architects, the BIs, the QIs, the devs, the leads. Everyone is sitting into that one particular vertical, which are nothing but the fence, and they understand the business and they understand the technical part as well. Everything that is designed on the technical area, they are able to relay that back to the business, and likewise. And that is where the common comes into the play, because this team has to be intact. You can't just pull out people and then push in people. Yeah, you can push in people for more learnings, but you can't pull out. And they will actually derive the commonality and will bring the platform live.
I think, yeah, just in addition to what Bala said, I think if so the question was, what challenges do we face? So, in addition to such sort of change being top down driven, because, definitely it always needs a dedicated funding if you're trying to make a paradigm shift, which Lakshmi just talked about, going from the standard services, which are anyway able to serve your purpose, but still you want to go with a domain driven design because that would lead to a more strategic approach. So definitely cost and funding and the vision of CIO team within that organization is important. I think the other challenge as well, which we have faced, was kind of a questions raised by platform managers, that if we go with a domain driven design, we are eventually going to increase our technical debt, because let's say if I have got a stack of SOA web services which are anyway fulfilling the needs, a business always sees the money first. So and now this shift is changing, which is a good sign, because everything is being driven API led. But the major challenge was, if we go with the domain driven design, we have got a REST API equivalent of that SOAP service. Now that SOAP service is already running in production. It is eventually leading to a tech debt. So you're ending up spending more on infrastructure cost and operations cost. So then it leads to, how do you migrate those services and amalgamate onto your existing APIs? Now that is a very big challenge, because the moment you change your endpoints, and endpoints as well as the definition, because SOA web services may be talking in XML. Now going forward, you want the consumers to make use of a JSON specification. So we are talking about a very big change here, because your consumers may not change, your providers, you can still handle those transformation, but how do you manage your consumer line of business? I think that was a major challenge we ran into. And there have been some tactical steps taken, kind of a wrapper was created which can still keep the same endpoint for the consumer. And, we were sort of doing the XML to JSON translation and then invoking the API. But I think that is one of the major challenges which we faced, where the tech debt was still increasing and business had two challenges. They have to roll out the new APIs and get on with the domain-driven design, as well as they have to address the tech debt.
Yeah, I think Puneet, just one input on those similar lines, that I think we recently had a feedback coming in from the business team on the similar fashion, right? So I think one of the things that helped the whole team understand the domain-driven design from my perspective was, we could call out, I know we have these individual APIs that provide the capability, but if you're as a amalgamation of all these services, if you're in a position to be able to offer a pricing as a service or a quote as a service, right, which is now seen by the business teams as well as a product, right? It's no longer just some APIs that you're rebuilding or another service that you're trying to come on or build or spend effort on. That's what they see as technical debts, right? So now if you give them the perception of how these effort that we're putting in together for the domain-driven design or focusing on domains and building as a service helps in the enterprise ecosystem in terms of, okay, to say, yeah, I'm building this as a service. So which means there is a pricing as a service, right? For example, I'm just giving an instance, right? So which can be used across enterprise as a system. So that's still talking about the reusability and all that good things that we do about talk about in the API driven integration, right? But it's more about changing that focus to say, I'm no longer just building silo APIs or single or just building services. I'm giving you a capability as a service, like pricing as a service, FX as a service, or quote as a service, right? Then the whole focus changes, right? You're no longer talking about APIs as services in that. So you're now talking about domain and the functional side of things, which was taken well in this instance, right? So if it helps, so that's one hint for you.
Yeah, no, I think we did adopt to the domain-driven architecture anyway, and I think that is how things were being led. But I think in terms of challenge, as Bala mentioned, I think this was one of the ground level challenge that was shared, because things always comes to the cost, that what would be the maintenance cost, what will be the cost of infrastructure if we keep on running the tech debt. Definitely the reusability aspect is understood, and I'm just reading comment from Stephen as well, I think where you mentioned that what is the opportunity cost of not adopting a domain-driven approach? And I think that's a very key thing. That is something which organization understands, and then they do not negotiate with that decision. So they do choose to go with a domain-driven approach, thereby enabling a strategic approach for the upcoming items. And I think as and when, let's say if a new project comes in, who have an interest in the same functionality of that, let's say the quote or policy feature that you talked about, then definitely we will use that project to do that migration from SOA to REST. I think that's how we are doing it at the moment.
Well, what I'd like to add is that it's often quite difficult when you have an organization that already has services running, whether they be point-to-point or SOA, to convince somebody that you want to change them, because it costs time and money, which are obviously so that the people that hold the purse strings have to make decisions about, do we replace something that's working or do we do something new? I think sometimes the best way to frame some of these discussions is to talk about things that ultimately the business understands, and it comes down back to time and money. And I think not changing, the opportunity cost of not changing is that you are slowing down future development. By making the change, you're actually you're enabling the organization to move faster, to get things done faster. And in this day and age, speed is critical. It gives you, business advantage. Process theory says that the faster you can get something done, the higher quality it will be. There's lots of reasons why you want to get things done quickly. And by making this change, you are building a foundation that allows organizations to move faster. And more than that, in days gone by, integration was seen as getting one system to talk to another. What we're talking about now is actually opening up entire platforms and domains of a business and allowing people to self-serve, either get data that's contained in those domains or functionality. And that not only makes things faster, but it also allows innovation to occur. So, very often these discussions are not about the technology per se, but the benefits that technology brings. And maybe it's important to try and do some kind of analysis as to, how fast you can go in future, or, anybody that's had point-to-point integrations where one change has a ripple effect through the system, would want alternatives to that. So it's about framing the conversation in ways that, not only technical ways, but ways that that business people and people that hold the checkbooks understand.
We sort of started this topic around automation, and we went off on a slight tangent, I think, in terms of domain driven and how that works and the benefits of moving towards that. What I do want to talk about or bring another use case to the front is something that Harry and the team at CAP worked on, which is kind of automating environment setup, because there was a lot of challenges around environment stability, etc. And again, that's a time reducing factor in terms of if your environments are unstable, then actually you have a lot of developers who are spending time stabilizing and fixing and defecting, triaging the environment, if you like. And again, that takes away from that team's capacity to deliver features sooner or faster. So Harry, do you want to talk a little bit about how that automation worked and how much time did it really save? I think that's probably the question. How much time were you spending in kind of environment triaging? And after you automated it, how much time did you spend after that?
Yeah, what we were initially doing is, so when we always speak about microservices, right? So when we have different environments, it's per API based, right? So initially what we were doing is we had around 10 to 15 APIs. So the properties to maintain on the environment, we were not having too many issues to maintain that. It was pretty much okay to maintain it. But when the API ecosystem started to evolve, when the number of APIs started to increase, and ultimately the environments also started to increase before going into prod, right? So that's when we started to face this issue of how will you maintain these properties per environment. So one of the solutions, what we have come across with basically to use a CSV file. Why I'm saying a CSV file is basically you have one set of properties across all environments. You can view it in a single view, right? So that's one thing. And the other thing is also what we have segregated is what changes from environment to environment and what doesn't change from environment to environment. So we have segregated those CSVs in that way, so that what happens is basically, if you're creating a new environment, right? Let's say you have 100 properties to create, and let's say only 80 properties, 80 of those properties doesn't change from environment to environment. It's only hardly 20 properties that gets changed, right? So that would help you out to segregate that. So you don't have to bother about those 80 properties. They are there always with you and it doesn't keep changing. And you'll have to just work on the 20 properties. That's one part of it, creating a CSV file to give a holistic view of all the environments and all the properties. Plus the second thing is to have segregation between your properties that keeps changing from environment to environment and those properties that are static. For example, you can say the URI of a particular API will never change within prod, right? But the host name keeps changing, right? Segregating that helped us out a lot into creating those CSVs. The next step was the basic automation where we started to do using Jenkins. So to read through the CSV file and to build your properties file, right? So that was clearly automated. You say for this environment, for this API, I want to build the properties, or you can build it. If you say for this environment, I want to build the properties for the whole system of APIs, I can build it. So that's when it helps us to do that. And in terms of manual interventions, I mean to say in terms of manual errors, because going through each properties, even you take 2-3 developers going through each properties, they are bound to make at least 10 to 15 mistakes, right? When you're going through this, when you're having the holistic view of all the properties in one go, in terms of making mistakes was less. And frankly telling, in terms of creating the environments, when we're doing it manually with 100 plus APIs for an environment, we used to take 2 to 3 days to get it completely stabilized. After creating of the property automation, we were able to do it in 2 to 3 hours. So, and we are consistently doing it in 2 to 3 hours now, because we know the pros and cons of doing it. That's the benefit we have got out of it.
One thing that I would add to Harry's statement there is, this typical approach is when you're doing what I would call traditional deployment into kind of a data center like architecture, where, even in the cloud, people spin up kind of infrastructure as if it was bare metal and, do deployments. Obviously, if you're in kind of a cloud native Kubernetes, OpenShift kind of land, then actually the automation will work slightly differently. And actually you get more automation in terms of how you do deployments. So that's quite interesting.
I would say, just based on experience. So I wholeheartedly agree with what Lakshmi said around automation, and I think it's really important. I think one of the things that I've seen at clients is, I'm thinking of a specific client now where they have a large number of tests that they run, but the tests have been written in such a way that every time the tests are brittle. So they're following a TDD approach, but what they're doing is they're scared to make changes to their Mule applications because the knock-on effect on and the time it takes to change their tests is actually where they're burning a lot of time. And so what I would say is that you need to be really careful about, it's really good to have, you need the automation, you need the tests, the test coverage, but you need to do it in such a way that it's loosely coupled and that you don't couple your tests directly to kind of implementation, because that's going to make the test brittle, and then what's supposed to be saving you time is actually going to cost you time. So it's really important that in each step of the process that things are done in the right way to get the actual benefits that they deliver.
Yeah. Have you got any examples of how you could make tests kind of loosely coupled?
I guess the simplest way to describe it, with the specific kind of use case that I was talking about in mind, is that you should be testing the behavior. So I'm not talking about unit tests, but you should be testing behavior rather than implementation. And what's happened is that these tests have started to couple themselves to implementation. So that becomes a problem when the implementation, even though the behavior might not change, the implementation changes, and that's breaking the tests. And that means that there's a massive effort to go and fix the tests rather than focus on the application. Yeah, that's one example of what to be careful of.
Yeah, I think that describes it very nicely in terms of testing behavior and not implementation. Everybody, thank you for your time. What I do want to do is just thank the panel again, Vaughan, Gil, Harry, Thejas, and of course Lakshmi, who's kind of spearheading this particular topic. In the next topic, Harry and Thejas are going to be spearheading it. So look forward to part 3 of the series.